বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
Hello everyone, welcome to the Hindu analysis for 2nd August 2021. Let us begin with the first article today. The first article that we are beginning with today is in regards to economy and recovery and the GST revenues that we have been following for the past few months. In the last month, we saw a dip in the collection of GST revenues for the month of May, where the collections dipped below 1 lakh crore. Again, we are seeing an uptick in the total GST revenues that were collected in July of 2021, which again increased or crossed the 1 lakh mark. Now, as far as the reasons why we saw a dip in the collection of GST revenues for the month of May, it is being directly pointed out to the fact that because of the second wave of COVID-19, and as a result of it, various states and union territories adopted the policy of imposing either complete lockdowns or partial lockdowns, and that was the result that was attributed to the fact that there was a reduction, or we saw a reduction in GST collections for the month of May. But again, in a positive trend and a bit of good news for the economic recovery in India, the GST revenues have crossed the 1 lakh crore for the first time after this many months. Now, as to the trends that we are seeing from this data, it has to be said that the growth in states and union territories have been pretty much uneven. When you compare the tax collections to last year of the same period, we are seeing a significant variations, right? We are seeing states with high level of unevenness in their growth and in their tax collections, though positive but highly uneven when compared to July of 2022, July of 2021. The state with some big industries which are heavyweights have recorded a sharp increase in their recoveries, and we are seeing less recoveries in states that are not well industrialized. So again, nonetheless, we at the end of the day, we are seeing a rise in collections, which according to the finance ministry is being attributed to as a sign of economic rebound at times such as COVID-19 pandemic. Moving on to the next article, India-China established hotline in North Sikkim. So before going into that, let us understand what a hotline is. So a hotline is a simple point-to-point communication link, right, in which a call can be automatically directed to a pre-selected destination without any additional action from the user end, right? If you simply pick up the phone, or you pick up the handle of the phone, the call gets connected to the other party or other end of the line, and they get notified of the communication. So it is a mechanism to remove any miscommunication gaps, any miscommunication or communication gap between two parties. This is generally done between two warring parties or two parties where there are certain outstanding issues. Now, the phone here would automatically get connected. For an example, you look at emergency communication services, right? You call up, they simply have to answer the phone without you doing anything or them doing anything. You both are communicating. This is to reduce time and complexities when establishing a communication line is of critical importance to prevent any fallout from miscommunication. Now, India and China has already have multiple other communication hotlines, particularly in eastern Ladakh area, particularly at Chushul and Beg areas. Now, this is the third hotline that is being set up or established between Indian Army at Kongra in North Sikkim and People Liberation Army at Kamba area in Tibetan Autonomous Region. Now, this is not the first time, as I said, we have other two military hotlines in eastern Ladakh alone. Similarly, we have same provisions with the Pakistani side also. This assumes significance because of the recent tensions between both of our countries. Remember, communication at this juncture is the most important aspect to prevent any further escalation of issues between both of our armies. A small miscommunication gap, a small misstep by either side will result in a full blown out war. Now, coming to the settling of outstanding issues in terms of troop disengagement or de-induction from contested areas, the two sides held the 12th round of corps level commander talks, particularly on Saturday on the Chinese side, particularly the Maldo side of the Chinese territory. Now, we don't know the outcome of the meeting. Remember, the Chinese have been pretty much hard set on their issues, stating that we are not going to move away from the areas that we currently occupy. As far as the outcome of the 12th meeting, we don't know what the outcome is. Neither side released any statements regard to this. And this is again a step further to remove any communication gap between both of our armies. This builds on the telephonic conversation that our foreign minister had with the Chinese counterpart, where both sides agreed to establish a new hotline between the foreign ministries itself, right? Not only the armies are connecting or communicating through hotlines, we are also establishing a hotline with the foreign ministry also, because at the end of the day, communication should be clear between not only the standing armies but also the diplomatic level also. Now, this is again a step to ensure timely communication, again as the backdrop of Ladakh standoff. Now, we both countries have a well-established mechanisms for communication at ground commander level, right? This is the 12th level corps commander talks, but there has been other ground level and various number of meetings between ground level commanders in the last few months. That is how they have been pretty much able to verify each other's action on ground in terms of patrolling areas and non-patrolling areas and contested areas and non-contested areas. So communication at this juncture is critical, and this hotline, though it is being established now, will certainly help in the future if and any situation arose that both sides need to communicate in order to reduce the tensions along the contested border. So again, this is the third hotline that is being established in this region by both the armies. Moving on to the next article, UNSC Presidency, Jaishankar lays out policy perspective. Now, India is all set to assume its UNSC chairmanship. Now, as a part of it, our External Affairs Minister was laying out the policy perspective that India will pursue when we assume the presidency of the Security Council in August. Now, it is a roadmap that India is publishing, or it is outlaying its roadmap or its policy perspective, meaning in the sense that these are the things that we want to achieve during our presidency. These are our priorities. This is our policy. We are not going to side with one party or the other party. We are going to be the mediatory, or we are going to be a party of mediation, where we will facilitate talks between two parties so that we find a common ground and a peaceful resolution to the conflicts that are raging around the world. So this is simply that it is simply a document that lays our vision to the world. Since we are assuming the presidency in August, we are saying these are our priorities, and this is the possible way or the policy way that we are going to approach to resolve conflicts in different zones. Now, when you look at the policy document, when you look at the policy perspective, one of the key commitments is regards to China, because we indicated we are going to give primacy to maritime security and freedom of navigation in South China Sea. The South China Sea issue is being entirely run by China, because China is the one aggressive party that is trying to unilaterally change the status quo in South China Sea. Now, they are challenging the freedom of navigation rights of other countries in that region, because they have built various contested artificial islands that they went on to militarize by building not only military infrastructure but also building observation radar observation stations, airports, whatnot, and these islands have been entirely militarized. Now, these islands are challenging other countries' vessels, not only naval vessels but also commercial vessels, when they pass through these contested regions. Now, again, India has clearly indicated that one of the primary objectives of our period during UNSC presidency is going to be maritime security, particularly dealing with the freedom of navigation issue in the South China Sea. Not only this, there are other four major conflicts that are raging in the Asian region that India wants to resolve diplomatically. One, the primary one in the Asian region is the Afghanistan issue, where Taliban is gaining significance and it is finding certain support from other South Asian countries like China, Russia and Pakistan. Not only that, we are seeing certain Central Asian countries like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan are trying to formalize their relationship with Taliban to protect their own internal security and border security. The other issues are as important as Afghanistan, that is Myanmar. The third issue is the Yemen conflict that is raging, where you are seeing Middle Eastern countries being divided into two warring parties and supporting local militias to fight one against the other, preventing a formal solution or a diplomatic solution to be found in Yemen. And Yemen is the least spoken conflict of all the conflicts that are raging around the world, and Yemen is resulting in highest number of deaths, civilian deaths, because of hunger, because of unprecedented killings of civilian population, and also is resulting to the highest number of human exodus from Yemen. You are seeing large number of people fleeing conflict in Yemen, and these people are risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean Sea to European Union. Again, this is the least spoken of all the conflicts, where countries like Qatar, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern countries are highly and heavily involved. They are actually financing militias on the ground. Saudi Arabia went to the extent of bombing the opposing parties using US supplied arms and ammunition. Now again, that is one conflict that India is willing to negotiate and navigate in order to find a peaceful resolution. The final one is the Syrian conflict, where Russia is actively involved. US as of now has pulled out to a greater extent, leaving a large power vacuum to be filled by Russia and other non-state actors in the region. Again, Syria is also experiencing a large number of lives being lost, civilian lives being lost because of the conflict, and it is staring at a huge humanitarian crisis in terms of hunger. As far as India's role at UNSC, India is hosting a virtual debate for heads of state titled Maintenance of International Peace and Security, Enhancing Maritime Security, a Case for International Cooperation on August 9. This is again to reiterate its stance and its primacy for ensuring maritime security in the world and in the region, particularly South China Sea, Indo-Pacific region. And this is not the first time. After 10 years, India is getting its presidency, because last time it was held during Minister of Housing and Urban Affairs Ministries Hardeep Singh Puri, who was serving as a permanent representative of India at Security Council in 2011. This is again India's chance to shore up friends, allies and like-minded parties in the region and in the world. And this role as the presidency of UNSC gives India the ability to communicate with these nations on a different level because of the position that it holds in the world right now. Right, India was able to use its UNSC presidency as a tool for conflict resolution. Though we found success in some cases, we didn't find much success in other areas. Hopefully this time will be different, because India is not the India that it was in 2011. There have been a lot of changes in the region itself because of the unilateral changes made by China in the region itself because of its wolf warrior diplomacy that it has adopted in the last decade or so. And given the importance that India has in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of both maritime security and regional security, and India's involvement in regional security metrics altogether will certainly help or enhance its hand in conflict resolution using UNSC as a tool. Again, the priority is going to be Afghanistan and Myanmar given the immediacy to our borders, and also the broader Asian region in order to ascertain India's allies and India's role in the security matrix of the region. Now, India is an elected non-permanent member of the Security Council, and in order to achieve this position, India had received a lot of support from Asian Pacific countries in the election. That we have to be very careful and cautious in understanding India's role as president of UNSC in the next coming 2 years, because this role is going to help India in furthering its agenda, furthering its presence in the region. Moving on to the next article, clinical trials for ashwagandha soon. Now, the Ministry of Ayush has collaborated with UK's London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to conduct a study on ashwagandha for promoting recovery for COVID-19 and COVID-19 patients. Now, All India Indian Institute of Ayurveda, which is an autonomous body under Ministry of Ayush, and the UK's London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have recently signed a memorandum of understanding after long drawn negotiations between both these institutions at institutional level and also at diplomatic level. Because two countries are involved, a memorandum of understanding has been finally signed to conduct clinical trials for ashwagandha on 2000 participants in 3 UK cities. In this study, in this clinical trial, 1000 participants will be given ashwagandha tablets to be taken to study the effect of ashwagandha on a short period and long periods, and 1000 patients will be given placebos that look same as the ashwagandha tablets but are not the ashwagandha tablets. You understand what placebo is, right? Placebo is, it looks like it, it tastes like it, but it is not the original product. Now let us look at what ashwagandha itself is. Ashwagandha, commonly known as Indian winter cherry, right? It is an Indian traditional herb that is associated with giving energy boost to people who consume it. It is also been associated with reduction in stress, and it is also has been associated with improving an immune system of a person who has been consuming ashwagandha. Now in UK it is easily available and accessible, and it is sold as an over-the-counter nutritional supplement, right? It doesn't need any prescriptions to be sold, and it doesn't need any prescriptions to consume it. It is directly sold as an over-the-counter nutrition or nutritional supplement in UK. In order to be sold as an over-the-counter supplement in UK, it had to pass stringent safety protocols or safety tests, and it has a proven safety profile in UK. Then only it has been given the clearance or go ahead to be sold as an nutritional supplement. So what are the advantages of this clinical trial? If it is found to be successful, if the trial is successfully completed, it would be a major breakthrough, because this study, if the results are successful, gives the scientific validity to India's traditional medicinal system, right? One of the biggest questions that anybody raises against the traditional medicinal system of India has been, what is the scientific validity of your medicine? English medicinal practitioners have been questioning the scientific validity of traditional medicines. They say that our medicine or our way of treatment or our way of medication or whatever you call it has scientific validity. We have a proven track record of clinical trials supporting our statement that these medicines work in treating patients. When some traditional medicinal practitioner comes along and says you can use this that are found in nature to treat any ailment, the first question that is raised against his or her statement is, what is the scientific validity of your method? Is there any clinical trial that had took place to say that whatever you are saying that is found in nature will treat this or that ailment? Can you prove it that they actually do treat those ailments? So in order to ensure that traditional medicine does not sidelined because of lack of scientific validity, these kinds of trials conducted between two international organizations will certainly increase their scientific profile and will also ensure wide-scale acceptance of such traditional systems. Again, this is a welcome sign in order to ensure wide-scale and public acceptance of India's traditional medicinal system. Now, is this the first time that they are conducting studies on ashwagandha? No, there have been several other studies on ashwagandha to understand its benefits, to understand its ability to treat various ailments. But this is the first time that Ministry of Ayush is collaborating with a foreign institution to investigate its efficacy on COVID-19 patients. Right? Recently, there was a randomized placebo-controlled trials of ashwagandha on humans in India, where it had successfully demonstrated its efficacy in reducing anxiety, stress, improving muscle strength, and reducing symptoms of fatigue in patients who were treated for chronic conditions. One of the biggest side effects of having a chronic disease or a chronic condition is that they experience a lot of fatigue in them. And if these ashwagandha tablets are found to improve their fatigue, improve their symptoms of fatigue, then this would be a welcome sign, because in almost of all of the cases, traditional medicinal methods don't have side effects that their English counterparts have. So this would mean that if you take traditional medicinal system, if they are scientifically validated, then you are essentially taking a medicine that is known to treat an ailment or a disease or a condition without the side effects of English medicine. Again, this is only bound to improve the profile of traditional medicinal systems in India and around the world, and also its practitioners, because in majority of the cases, traditional medicinal practitioners are termed as quacks, which is again just because they don't have the scientific validation that your method of treatment has, you are entirely sidelining or neglecting a valid treatment methodology that might actually be better than what we are currently suggesting or directing people towards. So moving on to the next bit of news, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will launch an electronic voucher based digital payment system called e-Rupee on Monday. This is the first step towards having a digital currency in our country. Now, what is e-Rupee? E-Rupee is a cashless and a contactless digital payment medium that will be delivered to phones of beneficiaries in the forms of an SMS string or a QR code. What it essentially is, it is like a prepaid gift voucher that one purchases from Amazon or any other retail store. Right? These are like prepaid gift vouchers that can be redeemed at specific centers without any credit or debit cards. Right? All you need is an SMS string or a QR code. You don't need a mobile app to redeem them, or you don't need internet banking to redeem them. These are simple prepaid gift vouchers or vouchers that can be redeemed at accepting centers without any credit or debit card or a mobile app or even internet banking. Now, eRupee will connect with sponsor of services with the beneficiaries and service providers in a digital manner without any physical interference. This takes away the human to human interaction in these kinds of services. When you take away the human to human interference or interactions, that reduces a lot of miscommunication, or in this case, for the purpose that eRupee is being launched, a lot of corruption also can be taken away or weeded out. Now in this scheme, the beneficiaries will be identified using their mobile number, which makes it unique, and a voucher will be allocated by a bank to the service provider in the name of a given person, and it would be only delivered to that person. So it also takes away the diversion of services or funds, and it will ensure that that service or that amount of money will reach to the designated and targeted person without any deviation. Again, eRupee is expected to ensure a leak-proof delivery of welfare services. Remember how significant role the direct benefit transfer scheme played in weeding out a lot of leaks in our welfare services delivery system. By simply ensuring that the money is directly deposited into the intended receiver's account, we took a lot of wastage or corruption from that system. This eRupee scheme is simply there to further the agenda of ensuring a leak-proof delivery system of services, not only welfare services, any other kind of services. But the intent behind launching eRupee is for betterment or further simplification and leak-proofing the delivery of welfare services in India, right? Delivering services under the schemes which are meant for providing drugs and nutritional support under mother and child welfare schemes, TB eradication programs, drugs and diagnostic schemes, right? You disseminate drugs and diagnostics under the specific schemes like Ayushman Bharat or Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, or any other state-oriented or state-centric schemes, and also centrally subsidized fertilizer subsidies, any other welfare scheme, whether it may be the central one or a state one. Since it is being launched by central government, various state governments also can adopt eRupee platform, which is being built by NPCI on UPI platform. So they already have all the necessary infrastructure to adopt this eRupee scheme or eRupee platform. All they have to do is create additional resources to host these services on existing infrastructure. That's it. It makes this adopting this scheme or this system much easier, rather than creating a whole new ecosystem to ensure leak-proof delivery of welfare services. So here is where the divergence of digital currency takes. We know that government and our central bank has been working on developing a central bank digital currency, right? eRupee is one step away from launching our own CBDC. It acts as an intermediary between us launching a digital currency and adopting digital currency policy in our country, because the launch of eRupee could potentially highlight the gaps in digital payment infrastructure, and addressing these gaps that exist in our payments infrastructure, particularly the digital side of it, will be necessary for the success of whatever the digital currency that India intends to launch in the future. So this is ensuring the gaps are filled in our digital payments infrastructure. As far as the digital infrastructure in our country, it has been a success because of the wide scale adoption and the level of penetration that we are seeing of UPI in India is testament to the fact that if services are provided, and if well-meaning and good, finely functioning services are provided people are willing to accept and adopt despite a learning curve in using those services. Now, how different is e-rupee from a digital currency? E-rupee will still be backed by existing Indian rupee as the underlying asset, and its sole purpose makes it different to a virtual currency. As I said, its sole purpose is to ensure leak-proof delivery of welfare schemes, and the way it has been rolled out is through voucher systems, not as a direct currency replacement or a currency supplement. Not a replacement but as a supplement through voucher system. Remember, voucher scheme and stamps scheme is used by United States and various other countries to ensure welfare schemes reach targeted or intended sections of the population without being diverted by corrupt individuals. Now, this is where it differs from the central bank digital currency or CBD. E-rupee is a voucher-based payment system, and CBD is issued by central bank that generally takes a digital form of the nation's existing fiat currency. In our case, it is rupee. So, e-rupee is voucher-based and it is different from a central bank digital currency. Okay, but both are backed by Indian rupee as underlying assets. In e-rupee case, it takes a voucher form. In a central bank digital currency phase, it takes a digital form of the fiat currency in our country. Now, the challenges with introducing CBDC is, although we have certain provisions in rolling out, we have the infrastructure to roll out digital currency in our country, we don't have the legal framework to roll out CBDCs. In order to roll out or introduce CBDC in our economy, in our country, we need to enable it by making changes to our legal framework, because whatever the legal framework or provisions that we have in our country right now are primarily synced for currency in paper form, not in digital form. Again, CBDCs are conceptually similar to currency notes, but they take a virtual form. This is in regards to e-rupee and central bank digital currencies. Thank you. Stay safe. Namaste.
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি প্ৰস্তুতি আৰু অধ্যয়নৰ নিৰ্ভৰযোগ্য ঠিকনা।
বৰঠাকুৰ IS একাডেমি।